Welcome back to Haunted and Historic Australia for another episode in our Criminals, Cutthroats and Convicts series. In this episode, we look at the beginnings of the boss, aka George Freeman, and his position within the A-Team. George David Freeman was born on the 22nd of January 1935 in Annandale, Sydney, to builder's assistant William David Freeman and Rita Eileen Cook, being the third child to the couple. But George's father didn't stick around, and despite Rita marrying again, their stepfather died shortly after, leaving Rita to bring up the children alone and with great financial difficulty. Sadly, no money usually means wayward children. Well, in these hard times it usually did. George, like many other children, poor, no role models, acted out and stole for survival. At age 12, he was arrested for theft and ended up on probation. He was expelled from 2 schools by this time and started working at the age of 14 as a stable hand. It was at this time that he must have enjoyed working with horses and discovered his interest in horse racing that would later assist him at the track. But on the side, he still stole. This would have allowed him to get by, but there is always the desire for more. So his thieving got worse, more daring, stealing cars, break and entering, and raids on businesses. It caught up with him, and in 1951, at age 16, he was sent to the Gosford training home for boys. He was meant to be there for 2 years, which was a lot more time than what Lenny had to do. It was a terrible place, as we have mentioned before, a place that bred the worst of the worst, rather than discouraging them. Full of abuse, most violent and violating. Many emerged much worse than how they went in. George continued to act out. Being there for so long, it's no wonder he revolted against them. He was then transferred to another hellhole, Tamworth Boys' Home, previously an adult jail, to house troubled boys aged 15 to 18. It was named as one of the harshest child welfare institutions in New South Wales. Clearly not the only one. Although I don't condone anything these criminals do, but it is so easy to see that they were created evils by those who should have shown them love, or at very least, safety and shelter. Instead, they found the opposite of all of that. Most of these boys, and girls too, who were housed in equally as awful places, as we have seen in our episode of the House of Horrors and Female Factory, these kids had already been hurt or damaged before coming to these places. And sadly, those who did not die there, and there were many children who did die in these places, came out worse and more troubled than they were to begin with. No longer just troubled, but completely ruined. Some came out pure evil. Those who were violated, as well as those that turned into violators. The older children preyed on the younger ones, and the adults who were meant to look after them all, take care of them all, or reform them, allowed all of this shit to go down. So, it's just a breeding ground. It was hell. It was hell for these kids. Thus, they turned into demons themselves. George himself actually swallowed a bar of soap to try and get out of being there. A doctor misdiagnosing it for acute appendicitis and performing surgery that he really shouldn't have had. But for poor George, coming clean about the whole thing would have meant that he would be severely bashed by who knows who. The adults, the older kids, take your pick. So surgery at such a young age seemed the more favourable option for him. Better than getting beaten within an inch of your life, I guess. But it is at this place that he makes a lifelong friend in Stan the Man Smith. And we'll get to him a little later. He's going to have his own episode too. At the end of the 2 years, he was sent off in a new suit and some change to come home. But things did not get easier. Not yet anyway. He was in trouble in less than a year, but now he was an adult, and sentenced for stealing meant Parramatta Jail, where he would encounter more criminals, and also someone he idolised, one Darcy Dugan, as many young criminals would have, looked up to the man who escaped jail. And that too is another story we're going to bring you as well. George was in and out of jail throughout his 20s. He was not reformed, he was lashing out, and he wanted to make money, but he couldn't. He just kept getting caught. And at one stage, he gets caught for safe cracking, or attempted safe cracking, and he goes to Parramatta Jail. This is where he meets another lifelong friend he would have in Lenny McPherson, Mr. Big. Maybe about 12 or 13 years older than him. He would come to idolise this man too. He would help him become powerful. He gave him the push he needed. He advised him to become an SP bookie, and a little bit of a green light too, as everyone else had to go through Lenny if they wanted to set up shop too. People could place bets without being present at the track and with those who were authorised to bet with. Thus began the illegal SP bookies or starting price bookmakers. It was illegal. But if you knew the right people, as Mr. Big did, you could get away with pretty much anything you wanted to. And after a short little stint of legitimate work at the state abattoirs, George Freeman lined himself up with him. Instead of getting caught all the time for trying to do small things, petty theft, he could become a greater criminal with more money, which meant more power, with the right guy, Lenny McPherson, and Stan Smith too. Joining the A-team was the best thing George Freeman ever did. Not, of course, for those who ended up on the wrong end of the stick, but for George Freeman in particular, things went pretty sweet herein. He married a Marcia Bedford in 1963 at a registrar's office. She'd been divorced, married before, and they were together for over 10 years before breaking up. Such was the life of a playboy like George Freeman, the boss, and the name The Boss actually came after a connection to a racehorse named El Capo, which means the boss in Italian. He was also viewed upon as Lenny McPherson's second. Such conflicting titles for this particular team, but it worked out very well anyway. They were both doing very well in their own right. Lenny was really the one that kind of brought it all together, but George Freeman made it his own. Still with Marcia when he did time at Fremantle Jail in 1968. Like Lenny, George didn't do much time, but in 1968 he was arrested in Perth, WA, with Stan the Man Smith on charges of conspiring to steal in conjunction with a close friend and international thief called the Duke, or Arthur William Delaney. He had many adventures and needs his own episode too. Both the Duke and George were fond of horse racing, as well as lots of money and living the high life. They were like two peas in a pod. But where George Freeman stayed in Australia, the Duke would pursue riches abroad, along with his kangaroo gang, which we'll go into more depth about in their episode. But things were foiled when they tried to make a move in WA. So, back to Sydney, George Freeman has an assignment from Lenny. and it's a good one. George and Stan have an all-expenses-paid trip to the US to meet and dine with Joseph Dan Tester. As mentioned in Lenny's episode, Part 3, Freeman was in awe of Tester, the way he lived and his assets. He no doubt from then on moulded himself on such a man. Being smart now, he would never do time again, although he was arrested along with Stan again for travelling on forged passports in the US. Despite the accusations that George was involved in murder, assault, race fixing, bribery, illegal gambling, casino running, and involvement in the drug trade, his convictions were in the past, and he would only be fined in the future were for SP bookmaking. This was a good time for George, involved heavily in whatever Lenny had going, his own SP bookmaking, and he was being set up to look after casinos. Enjoying a party held for Joe Tester at one of their associates' houses. He'd come a long way from the boy that had to swallow soap and receive surgery just to get out of somewhere he didn't want to be. He was now everywhere he wanted to be. The 70s were going to be good to George Freeman. By the 70s, George Freeman is immersed in organised crime in Sydney, right next to Lenny McPherson, Mr. Big, and his other mate, Stan the Man Smith. They were the A-team, the untouchables. They could do what they wanted to do, just so long as the kickbacks went to Lenny to pay off or bribe anyone, be it police officers, captains, commissioners, politicians, or the Premier himself. For a time, these three had it made. And it wasn't just a matter of paying off these high-ranking police or politicians. They actually drank with them in certain clubs. It was as if they were mates. You scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. And that worked well for the guys for a time. They actually were like mates to each other. The police and politicians even sticking up for the guys in the Royal Commission, rubbing shoulders with the elite, corrupt cops, pollies, even doctors, as we found with Nick Paltos. He was involved heavily in the organised crime as well, like in our Robert Trimboli Mafia episode. Terry Clark, Mr. Asia, was around. Rolling into the 1970s, everything's going well. Happily married for all purposes, living the high life in a Yowie Bay mansion on the water. He's made it. A steady amount of money coming in and possible work with the mafia. Lenny was paving the way. And with Joe Tester popping over, things seem to be coming along well. And Lenny calls a meeting, as we heard from Lenny's episode. All of the head honchos of organised crime get together. And Delaney makes an appearance again. Everybody's going to do well on this deal. They can feel it in their bones. It was what they'd all been waiting for. That concludes part 1 of George Freeman and the A-Team. Stay tuned for part 2 when we take a look at the next 2 decades of George Freeman's life. His second marriage, his children, and his death. If you're enjoying these episodes, definitely give the episodes a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you're aware when we're posting up part 2 of George Freeman and the A-Team.